there's a few unfamiliar faces here. Who's not in the clinic at the moment? Who's currently? Okay, yeah, cool. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of background, just a bit further. Thank you, Cindy, but a bit further of what gets me to the point where I am and my understanding of anxiety. And after 20 years of dealing with people clinically with this, what I want to share with you tonight is some of the shortcuts we've found to really just be able to flick the switch with people. I'll talk to you tonight about a broad range of topics which will cover, some complex kind of things that happen in our biochemistry, but the clinical way we deal with them is really quite simple. So although some of the information might be a little bit overwhelming at times as we go through it, I'm going to try and just simplify it in a way so okay, if that's there, I know what to look for and how to action it. So if you get any questions come up along the way, feel free to ask them. And I've also got some sheets that there's on some of the bits of information we'll talk about tonight that have a little bit more complexity to them. There's some sheets up here that you can pick up at the end, which will give you a bit more of an understanding about what's involved there. So back in my university days, I majored in neuroscience, and I found understanding the brain and studying that, using your brain to study the brain was such an amazing task, and there was so much underlying complexity, and I was always in awe of it. Hi, welcome. You're all right. Come on in. And then you do your masters in chiropractic, and chiropractic is really about the nervous system, and they teach it mostly at university about a structural kind of aspect of that, the physical alignment components and how that affects the rest of your body. But when you get into clinical practice, you quickly learn that there's a whole lot more going on, and that there's physical forces that affect us for sure, but emotional drivers are huge for us, and especially in this day and age where there's so much more stimulation and so much more things that we're aware of and that we've got to deal with. So tonight we'll talk about where some of those stresses come from and how to deal with that. In my journey of health as well, I found some challenges with my own health along the way, and then they weren't resolved by physical approaches, and I had to actually seek out other things to work that out. And I found that, one of the things that flared up in me was an inflammatory condition, and the only thing that fixed it was when I stopped eating. So then I was like, oh wow, this is like 15 years ago. So back then there was not much information about the whole microbiome thing and the gut flora and how that affects inflammation, how that affects your brain and all those sorts of things, which we'll talk more about tonight. But I found it accidentally from being overseas, getting food poisoning, not being able to eat for a week, and getting out of bed after a week going, oh my God, I feel the best I've felt in years. So then I was like, okay, there's something I can do about this. There's something that I can do to change this inflammatory cycle in my body. And that put me on that journey of understanding the gut and how that plays out in that. And now that's the biggest sort of trend out there in the health field at the moment, because we're realizing it's linked to everything, And we have our three brains that we have to deal with. We have our brain up here and our brain here, which also produces neurotransmitters, and we have our brain in here, which is our gut, which has more neurons than the spinal cord. So all of these things are feeding back and into each other the whole time, And the days of trying to hit a one-hit wonder kind of thing for complex health issues, especially something like anxiety, I think are over. I think we know too much now to think that we can just take a pill and everything will be okay. We see the side effects of that, we see the complexity that brings up, and also in the spectrum of anxiety, where anxiety, we have anxiety disorders, which, where the brain can be really overreactive and highly sensitive to a lot of things, to, down the other end where it's just anxiety because of a pressure situation, or anxiety because, you've got so much to do in every day. And I don't know about you guys, but this day and age, you never really get your to-do list done. It's never really finished. There's always more things coming in. There's always, more information that you have to deal with from emails, Facebook, Messenger, all the different social media streams out there. And really, all those different points of contact are things we feel responsible for, and they're all designed to fire a part of our brain called the amygdala anyway. And the amygdala, which I'll talk to you about in a second, really gets our attention and puts us on alert. So if your phone buzzes, that stimulation being an unexpected thing fires the amygdala, fires the reptilian brain, makes you pay attention, because it could be an opportunity or it could be a threat. Okay, and that's how our body perceives it. But just getting that happening to us all the time is increasing that tone of our system, and that's making us much more sensitive to anxiety. So then you have a group of people out there who that kind of stimulation they thrive on, okay? And then you have groups of people out there who that kind of constant stimulation tips them over the edge because there's genetic susceptibility that just makes you unable to handle that, okay? So I'm going to cover that tonight and give you an understanding of that, which I think is really important, because if you happen to be one of those people, it's a pretty reasonably straightforward fix, but you need to know it. Otherwise, the consequences later on in life are very, very significant. Okay, so when we talk about anxiety, of course, we're talking about a persistent, intense worry and fear, not associated with any real threat at the time. But anxiety can also be a real threat at the time, okay? So, which might just be a deadline next week or pending things that we've got to deal with. And that's also important too, because what I see in practice a lot is the cost of that sort of anxiety as well. And when people start to overflow with the amount of stress that they have, okay? Because then you look at how do people adapt to anxiety? Well, any ideas? What are your thoughts about how people adapt to stress? What's the most common thing that people do at the end of the day?
Ignore it.
They can ignore it. Okay, so that's when it's fight or flight, and you have fight, flight, or withdrawal. Okay, so withdrawal is one response to that stress process for sure. To try and avoid it at all costs. Okay, what else? What else do people do?
Drink or drink.
Yeah. The biggest thing I'm dealing with people is the cycle of wine at night, coffee in the morning, okay? So up goes the noradrenaline in the morning, gets all the stress hormones going, have trouble unwinding that, especially the people who we're going to talk about a bit more tonight. And then they need wine to settle that down, but then wine pushes up histamine, upsets their gut flora, and then they're caught in this loop, because then they don't sleep very well back in the morning, need a coffee, okay? And there's this cycle that just continues and burns people out really quickly. And then you add the stress on that we're getting now, just increasing awareness and points of contact that we have, and people start not coping, okay? And there's a huge cost to that, because if you start managing things with wine, or you start managing things with food, which is another thing that people do, then you're having a stress and then you're adding another stress to it. You're adding a toxicity stress, and that's going to add up over time as well. And it adds up in weight, it adds up in acidity in the body, and all these things add up to degenerative sort of issues that we have to face, which are completely avoidable if we just have different tools. So a key thing that comes up as well is a lack of trust with respect to one's own ability. So, and especially when you feel like there's a lack of resources to adapt and thrive in the face of threats or opportunities. Okay, so a big thing that we see today is a lot of teenagers getting put on medication for anxiety. And although in some cases that's appropriate, in a lot of cases it's just because, it's like if they took that child to a carpenter, he'd hit him with a hammer, okay? Because that's the tool that's there at the time by the person they've seen, okay? But it's really not that appropriate for what they've got going on, because what they need is some tools, and what they need is some awareness, and what they need is to start to believe in their resources. So if you actually did to give them something that says, oh, here, take this, what does it tell them? Okay, it gives them a message that they're not coping, that take this and everything will be okay, but really you haven't dealt with anything yet, you haven't learnt from that. So it's a risk, and sometimes you need to do both. Like sometimes there's a real biochemical reason that can't be managed nutritionally that needs some medication, and then you need to develop skills. Okay, so there is that spectrum as well. So I'm not saying there's no place for it. It's just that it shouldn't be the fastest growing area in the pharmaceutical industry. So obviously we get those, everyone knows the symptoms of anxiety. So who here has had an anxiety attack? Okay, and they're pretty scary. They're debilitating, and they're very intense, and that feeling of that loss of control that goes with it, and then how that affects your breathing and your overall physiology. But then there's also the other side of anxiety where it's not quite going that far, but there's so much discomfort at thinking of moving in the direction you need to go in, and that's when you start to think, well, I just want to withdraw from it. Okay, and that paralysed will state leads to procrastination, which leads to accumulation of stress, and then your body's resources start to shut down. And even though it says 1 in 3 women will experience anxiety, it's really everyone experiences anxiety, right? Okay, it's an emotion we all go through when we've got something happens unexpectedly or a demand goes up in life. But 1 in 3 people will have a real anxiety disorder, okay, which is significant, like panic attacks and that inability to cope. Okay, it's Also common with women around pregnancy and just after pregnancy because of all the hormonal changes. And also, again, if you have these genetic susceptibilities and during pregnancy you lose a lot of your nutrients, all of a sudden you're much more susceptible to these things as well. And 1 in 5 men can get an anxiety disorder, but I think, again, men's probably much worse than that. Men just don't seek help, they seek beer, you know, and you just got to look at what happens, you know, in that sort of, those circles of things, you know, when you look at the demographics of men. So then you have to look at some of the big issues that we face out there as well, which, you know, that in males under 44, it's the leading cause of death is suicide, okay? And that's a combination of anxiety and depression, okay? Both of which fit into the spectrum of what we're going to talk about tonight. And, you know, in the last month, I've been dealing with a lot of people with PTSD who've had to deal with people who've committed suicide, people in their family. And just the amount of stress that they go through around that. And it's something that doesn't get talked about in the community very, very often, and we all stress and worry about all these other diseases, but you think, wow, that's their biggest killer, and surely that's preventable, you know, is if we understand how all this stuff works and there's a support available and people know what's available to them, then they can move through that crisis phase, especially teenagers who often hit their first big crisis, their first one. You know, we know as we get on in life, there's lots of them, okay? Well, they have their first big crisis and they're like, oh, I can't cope, you know, and they check out. And, you know, because they've got these, you know, biochemical imbalances plus a whole bunch of different hormonal things going on and the social pressures of today. But they need skills and awareness of how to move through that, because once you do move through that, you come out of it empowered with a whole new approach to things that really sets your trajectory, you know, and gets you on course for the rest of your life. So as I've already alluded to, there's the real kind of reason why this is increasing is, you know, is the social media aspects of things now. The scale of kind of interconnectivity and the cost of doing something embarrassing and the way and the cyberbullying aspects of that, which happen all the time. It's so common. I don't think any kid really goes through year 8 and 9 and gets away with it. You know, there's always a point in which it turns on them and they've got to deal with that, and they've got chat groups that are all happening which they get excluded from, and it's full on. And I see it all the time at work and what people have to go through, and I've also got 3 kids of my own and I've watched them go through it. And it's not easy, but again, if they know where to turn to and get help with these things and they can talk about it, you know, you can a lot of good can come out of it, because you know as you're growing up that, you know, some of the challenges that happen to you really shape you and make you a better person once you integrate them, you know. But if they stay unresolved, then there's something that control us, you know, and we're always trying to, you know, not let anyone brush up against that thorn that we've got sticking in us, you know, because we haven't learned to take the thorn out, so we've got to make sure no one else touches it and no one sees it. You know, another thing you're facing once the kids get to 14, 15, 16 is recreational drugs, you know, and it's massive out there. So I know my daughter's in year 11 and she openly talks about what happens at her school and how few of them there are who don't do it, you know. So it's the majority who are actually doing it, which is intense, you know. And then again, you've got the subgroup of them who are just prone to their body not detoxing well and a bit more prone to mental issues, and that obviously tips them over the edge very easily. Then you've got the low self-esteem and body image issues that come up, and constantly, you know, all the Instagram kind of things that are going around, and then you get measured on your status on that. And then, you know, so if you've got all that stuff going on and you're not feeling really good, you generally want to go and eat sugar and those sort of things to make yourself feel better. So then you end up with the gut inflammation and that cycle that feeds back into it. Because what you'll learn tonight too is that the gut flora themselves are producing 90% of the things you need in your brain. Okay, something like serotonin, 90% of it's made in your gut. Okay, if you've got the wrong bacteria in there that doesn't make serotonin, that makes something else, which can make excitatory neurotoxins instead, like streptococcus, and actually drive anxiety. You know, so, and then because it prefers that environment, like Candida and streptococcus, prefer a low pH colon, okay, to live in. So they'll change the pH so your enzymes don't work, you can't digest your food as well, and they get to proliferate. But they produce neurotoxins, especially through the night. And then of course we've got traumatic events that kids go through and learning to deal with those, because stuff happens at every age. Bullying and cyberbullying we talked about. And then the other thing we see these days as well is kids that just don't get any downtime. Kids that are always on something every afternoon, and everything that they're doing is actually a performance measured outcome. It's like, I've got to be here, it's all about winning something, and that again, I see that happening in kids like 10, 11, 12, and instead of having one sport they're into like 4 sports, and they're at a high level in all of them, and just lots of pressure, so they might be really good at it, and quite talented at certain things, but the bottom line is they've got a pressure to perform it every single afternoon, and your brain's not designed to do that. Your brain's designed to engage in a certain way and then do something else, and then daydream for a little while, and those sorts of things have that change through the gears, where we find that kids are always in one gear because they're either engaged in it or they're watching it. Okay, and when you're watching it and you're flicking through things quickly, you're using a part of your brain that has to make a decision about it every single time. Do I want that? Do I not want that? What do I think about that? Is that okay? I'm going to comment on that. Am I not going to comment? If I comment, what will that do? All these things run a part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex, which I'll talk about more in a second as well. And that part of your brain requires lots of energy. And if it doesn't have the energy it needs, doesn't have the battery power required, then, because its job as the executive is to stop everything else down below it from saying too much. So if you can't control what's going on down below, then all those primitive things, all the fight or flight stuff starts to come up. And so here it is, okay, with your brain, this is your reptilian brain down here, okay? So these parts of the brain have been present in all animals for a long period of time, okay? But then in here is the mammalian brain, okay, which is where most of you process a lot of your emotions, and it's just present time. There's no future or past. And then you have up in here, which especially this area here at the front, your prefrontal cortex. It's the executive function. It's what makes us human. What allows us to assess things critically, make decisions about things, plan and organise our future, worry about the past, okay. So, and we have 2 sides. Your right side prefrontal cortex is generally negative in its emotional slant, and your left prefrontal cortex is generally more positive, okay? So if a person is quite negative in their outlook or quite pessimistic, then they're more dominant on the right side, okay? And it's why some people, when they are really artistic, can be prone to negative thinking, and have those crises of confidence. Whereas people in the left brain, a bit more analytical, a bit more strategic, and can be a bit rigid, but they can be more positive emotion there. And there's obviously an overlap. It's not so black and white with anything in the brain, but they're the 2 dominant aspects. And what you find is when you meditate, which is a very important tool to learn, that meditation itself helps to build the left prefrontal cortex. It builds more hardware in that area. Okay, so if you've got more cells and more neurons, you've got more ability to suppress the thoughts that you don't want and control them. Who watched the show recently on The Secrets of the Brain? Did anyone watch that? It was on SBS. Well worth going back and having a look, because there was some cool research on there. One of the ones they did was they got 2 groups of people to go in and watch a movie that was quite a powerful, emotive movie. And one group of people were allowed to express all their emotions, whatever they wanted. And the other group had to sit there and contain every emotion and show nothing. And the group that came out who had to contain all their emotions came out and were physically weaker when you tested them. So when they did a test to just test their grip strength, they were all physically weaker, by a long way. And that was really highlighting just how much energy you use to control emotion. So if you've got more negative emotion going on because you started to accumulate things through life, you can imagine how you can just start to feel tired just from the effort to control the thoughts that are coming up. And that's a big role that neuroemotional technique plays, which I'll talk about more later. But this little guy in here, the amygdala, that's the guy that creates anxiety. Okay, that's the part of the brain that drives all the fears. It's very, very important to us because it is there to make us be aware of any threats. If you're a little lizard out there, then your amygdala is constantly monitoring the environment for anything that's out of the ordinary. So if a blade of grass moves, the lizard will move straight away, okay? Because it doesn't know if that's a cat or a predator of some description. So even though it's just a blade of grass moving, it's going to move, okay? Now with us, we run the amygdala back through the prefrontal cortex up here. So we go, what was that? okay? And we go, well, what do I want to do? Am I going to run? Am I going to deal with it? Am I going to look at what it was, okay? But we assess it quickly before we do anything with it, okay? But the amygdala is something that is easily sensitized. So when we have a situation happen that, we might think puppies are really beautiful, love puppies, and all of a sudden they get bitten by a dog, okay? And now dogs are bad, okay? But the amygdala also generalizes things, okay? So it's not just dogs are bad, but I don't like any animals anymore, okay? So it can go in that way as well. So it's once it's sensitized, it's slow to desensitize generally if left to its own devices. It stays on high alert and takes a long time to extinguish that, okay? So the way we approach that, the way we deal with the amygdala and these different aspects that can affect our health is we do what we call the home run formula, okay? So when we put anxiety in the middle, we realize that there's physical things that can create anxiety, okay? There's physical traumas that can affect the body, that can affect the tone of the nervous system, that can actually, if someone's in chronic pain, then they can start to feel anxious as well because of the way it just upregulates things in the brain. Then we have the emotional area, okay? So the emotional triggers, emotional events, unresolved stresses that can actually drive anxiety or drive emotion. We have toxicity as well. So toxicity, things like heavy metals, things like gut dysbiosis, those sorts of things, again, all affect feedback into anxiety. If you were to have too much mercury in your system, and mercury displaces zinc, and zinc's required to have a healthy gut wall, zinc's required to make serotonin, the neurotransmitter that calms your system down, then that could be the key thing that's causing anxiety to that person. And we've just got in the most effective way for testing for mercury now, and methyl mercury. That's testing for heavy metals is a challenge because it's hard to get a real accurate sense of what's going on in the body with the current testing, but a new one's come out from the States. It's very accurate, especially for methyl mercury, which is what's released from your teeth, okay, when you've got amalgams and those sorts of things. So now we can test that and look at what the real levels are. Obviously the biochemistry plays a huge role in terms of nutritional biochemistry and the biochemistry of how your body's making these things. And then in different people, there's just different priorities. So it's knowing where to go to with all of those components. So the biochemical factors, if we look at that base first up, there's things called gene SNPs, okay? And SNPs stand for single nucleotide polymorphisms, or are just a change in that particular gene in an individual for some reason, okay? And the key ones that I'm just going to talk about one of them tonight called the MTHFR, so it's pretty common, but there's a couple of others that are really important with anxiety as well. There's another thing called pyrrole disorder. Again, it's really common out there, especially in females. And it's one of the things that really affects your ability to absorb zinc and then activate your B6. It affects serotonin a lot. There's nutritional deficiencies due to poor diet and gut inflammation. If you're one of those people who has the lumps on the side of your arm here, okay, the little chicken skin that people get, then you're not absorbing your fatty acids properly. You've got inflammation in your gut, and that's a key thing that stops you absorbing your nutrients. And then systemic streptococcus infection. These are the kids who have had chronic ear infections, heaps of antibiotics, then they get tonsillitis, then they might get their tonsils out and stop getting tonsillitis, then they get other chest infections and lung infections as they get older, might develop asthma, but they get lots of antibiotics when they're kids. They develop a really resistant form of strep that lives right through the whole system. So it's in their sinuses, in their throat, and then when we look at their gut, it's all through their gut, okay? Sometimes being at the level of 99% of their aerobic flora, okay? Which you could imagine if you're supposed to have 95% E. coli that produces all your neurotransmitters and those sorts of things, and your tyrosine and your CoQ10 that gives you energy, and all of a sudden you've got this other thing that doesn't do anything really good for you and actually takes your iron out and doesn't make the things you need, you might be having some issues with getting the nutrients and getting the energy that you need. And that's actually really common. There's so many kids out there who, with the average child by the time they're 5-7 courses of antibiotics, and that's enough. That's enough to tip it over the edge and then drive that whole system, Sorry about the blurriness of this one. But so the MTHFR cycle is really about something called methylation. And methylation is really important as a chemical process because it affects our DNA, it affects our detox cycles, it affects our neurotransmitter recycling. So it plays a really hugely important role in things. And what you're seeing here is the key part of this is called the folate cycle, okay? And this is how you take like folic acid or folates out of green leafy vegetables and all those sorts of things, and turn them into the active form of that, which is 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. So that's the actual form of that your body needs to use. Okay, just like your body doesn't use glucose as energy, it uses ATP, but it gets to ATP through your mitochondria. Okay, so these things that we use, what's the active thing that our body actually utilizes? So that's the actual active form. But if you have a gene snip here, so that gene's no longer allowing this cycle to spin that way, then it affects how this cycle spins as well. Okay, and if this cycle can't spin, then you can't produce glutathione, which is your main detoxifying agent. It's how you get rid of heavy metals. It's how you recycle your hormones. Okay. And if it's not spinning here, then it affects the way this one spins too. And this one's turning tryptophan to serotonin, okay? All your antidepressants mostly are focused on serotonin, okay? And tyrosine to dopamine, okay? If you can't produce enough dopamine, then nothing in life is particularly exciting, okay? That's that feeling where it's just, nothing's interesting you anymore. If you're really flat, at one level it can go into a really depressed, hopeless state. But even as just an everyday level, this is especially happens with time, is that you can just go, nothing really interests me anymore. So then I'll just drink or do something. I need to do something to kick my brain into gear, is how people start to feel. But it's just because they're not firing dopamine up in their body anymore. If you don't, and that's because they don't have the bacteria in their gut that synthesizes tyrosine for them. So you can give tyrosine as an amino acid really easily, and they pop up out of it quite quickly. But then it gives you time to get the gut right. So as we've talked about, methylations for toxic metals like mercury and lead, which are everywhere now. You don't have to, any fish you eat is full of mercury. It doesn't matter which one it is now, it's pretty much all of them, okay? So it's just depends on how well you can manage that. But especially, everyone knows to avoid the pelagic fish and all that kind of stuff, right? Like tuna and swordfish and, okay? Just making sure everyone's aware of that, because there's no safe levels of those guys anymore, okay? They're all pretty toxic, and I wouldn't touch them at all. Tuna, yeah, and even tin tuna. Like tin tuna is smaller generally and not as bad, but there's really like one tin a week would be your limit, so you can't rely on that as a source all the time. Except if you have the constitution that handles it, for one, it's good to know that. And secondly, is if you, there's some cool things out there that are called zeolites, which if you have zeolite when you have fish, it binds any mercury and gets rid of it before it gets into your bloodstream. So that's a pretty important tip on that one. And the rest of the fish is good for you, it's just that the mercury issue is a problem.
What's the chemical you use to get rid of so mercury doesn't go in it?
It's a zeolite. Okay, so it's a type of clay which has been purified, and it's got an electrical charge on it. So it just and for a tiny molecule, it's got a huge surface area. So it just grabs any mercury, lead in that kind of order, mercury, lead, copper, and then it starts to bind even things that the toxic bacteria make, such as histamines and ammonia, and all that kind of stuff. So the kids who get eczema and the kids who can't sleep at night, the kids who stay up late and can't get to sleep, that's nearly always too much histamine. And they'll be scratching away and stuff. And that's often, it's to do partly airborne allergens and that kind of stuff, but then also partly gut dysbiosis that's producing too much histamine generally in their system. So methylation is also involved in hormone regulation, which is really important, especially when you talk about estrogen dominance later in life, and then if you have too much estrogen, how that drives growths of things. So that can be associated with tumours and that kind of stuff. And your energy production. Methylation plays a huge role in how your body makes energy and neurotransmitter formation like we talked about. But also importantly that parts of the DNA are also methylated. So methylation can be used to turn genes off and turn genes on. So genes aren't a fixed thing that you have. Genes are something that are a potential. Okay, and with that, the genes are affected by something called epigenetics, and epigenetics is how we respond and adapt to our environment. So they did experiments on mice where they really stressed the mother mice out. Okay, the mother mice that gets really stressed. Her kids, the baby mice, also get stressed because the mum's stressed. And then when the stress is taken away, the kids of those kids stay stressed for 5 generations. Okay, because of epigenetics. Now, if they had an ET for mice, I think we would try to change that epigenetic expression. But that's what happens if nothing intervenes. Okay. But obviously, you know, there's things if you can turn them on, you can turn them off as well. You just got to know what's the key, okay? Important thing with methylation as well as time goes on is that methylation affects your circulatory system, it affects your brain. If you don't methylate very well, then it's also associated with brain inflammation, which relates to Alzheimer's and those things later on, but also can affect your cardiovascular system, so more prone to strokes and heart disease and those sorts of things. So if someone is to have the MTHFR gene anomaly, and this is a simple blood test, you know, you can get it done yourself, costs $80, okay, and it's worth checking for. You know, I thought there's no way in the world I would have the MTHFR gene, okay, but then again, I was like, oh well, I did get an inflammatory thing when I was 25. That's kind of unusual, and I did notice in my mid-30s that I'd go to bed and I'd kind of vibrate in bed even though I wasn't stressed, but my body was stressed. Like my body still had too much noradrenaline in it from a day's work. I'm like, oh, that's weird. What's going on with me? And then I went and tested it, and I was like, wow, I've got an expression of this gene. I was like, thank God for that, because then I found that out, and I was like, look back at my history and go, oh yeah, of course. When I look at my family lineage, there is those sort of things going on, and I was able just to take the nutrient that bypasses it and just stopped it straight away. But if I have not got onto that, then you know there's a whole bunch of consequences from that. So it's not something to be terrified of, it's just something to be informed of. Because once you know, okay, here's what I do to get around that. And then there's markers in your blood you can check to know how you're going. So every year I just check, see what my levels are and go, great, I'm right on track with that. If I'm going through a particularly stressful time, I know where my weak link is, I know what I need to take the most. So it's just understanding those things. So really importantly, if you're one of the people who have this one, then you need to avoid folic acid supplements because you can't convert folic acid. It's not the active form, it's a synthetic form. So you get all these mums getting told to take folic acid, and what you're going to notice out there is folic acid is going to get taken out of everything now. Because we've known it, practitioners have known it for ages, but you know, there's a whole movement out there that's happening, and then there's the TGA in Australia that stops companies putting new things in nutrients easily because it costs a lot of money to do so. So, but now you'll see like Metagenics, all those guys pulling all the folic acid out, replacing it with the active form folates because so many people have these gene anomalies. Because it's becoming more common as well, the activation of these genes because of the toxicity in our environment. So toxic environment weakens your genes and they express more of these sort of things. So it's very important that if this is there, that you take the active form 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, which you can get as a liquid or you can get as a capsule. Liquids are really good with kids because you can kind of titrate exactly how much they need, and the tablets are just easier for adults, but some people just absorb liquids better, so it's just testing that as well. And you also need to know that management of stress, if you have these, becomes very important. You've got to have the lifestyle things in there that stop your body from overwhelming in that way. So, you know, things like NET, chiropractic, yoga, meditation, and fun. You know, fun's really important because it resets the brain. It resets your serotonin, all that kind of stuff naturally. And it's, what we've got to get out of is that constant problem-solving thinking, constant to-do list. Because if we're in that all the time, we're just burning out the batteries of our prefrontal cortex. So knowing when to step out of that and take that time for that break. And it doesn't take that long to reset it. 20 minutes can reset it. You can lie down, have a power nap for 20 minutes and reset the ATP in your prefrontal cortex. So instead of going, God, I'm going to have that, you know, second coffee this afternoon, you know, if you just go, God, I just need 10 minutes to lie down. The biggest stress we face in life is gravity, right? So standing up is the hardest thing we have to do in the day in reality. And if you have a brain injury, you'd soon work out that that's the case. But because we've learned it when we're so young and it's stored in our brain, we think it's really easy. It's actually really complex. Only got little feet and we stand pretty tall and we've got to deal with the balance issues of that. So that takes a lot of energy. So if you just lie down and give yourself 10 minutes, that can make a huge difference to your prefrontal cortex. Very important for mums who've got to pick up kids and, you know, it's a rush and, you know, and if you've rushed all day to have that fitted everything in between 9 and 3 and then you pick up the kids and you're right at that point where you're really tired and the kids don't go easy on you when you're tired. They notice you're unavailable, so that requires more energy from them, okay? So, you know, and then you end up at the end of the day, well, I need a wine, you know? But if you just go, okay, if you know that in advance, then you can actually, you know, if you know how to meditate, that's the best time to do it. Or even if you don't know how to meditate, you just lie down for 10 minutes and close your eyes. And don't think of that as a luxury thing to do. Think of it as an absolute necessity to do. It could be saving your life, you know. So it's such a simple thing, but it just makes such a big difference. Your brain just needs some time to catch up. That fatigue you're feeling is real. as a cost. You're starting to use your core vitality to get things done. That's not helpful. It also means that as you're filtering your things that are coming in at you, you don't have the resources to respond the way that you really possibly should. Okay, you're going to respond in ways that maybe aren't that helpful, and that tone means that gets reflected back at you, and you start to deal with conflicts and stresses, which are completely avoidable if you're in the right space to start with. So there's 34 known mutations of the genes. In blood tests, we just test for 2 of those because they're the most common variants, and they're called, I won't even go through it, but this one here and this one here. Okay? And what you'll see on a blood test, you can be either heterozygous or homozygous. Okay, heterozygous means you got one from just one of your parents, the other parent didn't have it. Okay, if you're homozygous, it means you got one from one parent and the other parent had it as well, so you've got a double whammy. Okay, if you get the double whammy, then that can lead to a 70% loss of function of that gene. So imagine if your 70% can't drive that methylation cycle I showed you before that does all those things, that's a big deal. Okay, and that means when you add stress to that person, that's a weak link. They're not going to cope as easily and stuff's going to go wrong. Okay. But even just heterozygous, just having one copy of them from one parent and the rest of it being normal, it can still be somewhere between 20 and 40% reduced. Okay, so, and especially if there's other stress that's going on. So the other key thing that relates to anxiety biochemically is pyrrole disorder. Who's heard of pyrrole disorder? Don't worry, it's very common. Okay, and again, another one that's super common in kids, super common in females as well. One of the key reasons I've put this slide up here is that you often see the white spots on their nails, okay? And with teenagers, they become a bit feistier than normal. And basically, pyrroles leads to just the emotional swing being greater than normal, okay? It means that as their body breaks down hemoglobin, it creates a byproduct that binds their zinc and stops the zinc from getting into their cells. When that happens, you don't activate your B6, and when you can't activate B6, then B6 is responsible for all of those neurotransmitters conversions, okay? To take tryptophan, the amino acid, into serotonin, to take dopamine, tyrosine into dopamine or noradrenaline, okay? So the things that make us feel good, we can't synthesize it, so we become depleted as soon as there's stress. So the signs and symptoms to look out for with this one is white spots on the fingernails, hypoglycemia, like the kids who come home and they just lose it when they go home from school because they ate at lunchtime, if they did. Often you open the lunchbox, they haven't eaten because they're too busy running around. And then they come home and they just lose the plot because they're hypoglycemic. Okay? When they're hypoglycemic, you can't negotiate with them. There's no point even commenting about their behaviour, you just need to feed them. Okay? And then they make a comeback. But they're more prone to food allergies because you don't have enough zinc, okay? And zinc plays a key role in your immune system balance as well. So you get digestive weakness because zinc is also responsible for activating your gastric acid. So if you don't break down if you don't produce enough gastric acid, you don't break down your proteins in the first place, okay? And also, if you don't have enough gastric acid, you tend to get more parasites, okay? Because the reason why dogs can go and chew a bone that's been out there for weeks is because they have better pH than us, or lower pH than us. Okay, but if we don't have enough gastric acid, we're prone to recurrent infections and parasites. With that, you're obviously getting poor stress management because you're not producing the neurotransmitters, and much more prone to anxiety, depression, and episodic anger. Zinc and pyrrole disorder also tends to affect short-term memory. So these are the kids, they're a bit more irrational, they're having bigger mood swings, they walk out the door without taking their school bag, they're hard to get organised in the morning and that kind of stuff. And because of that, parents tend to yell at them more, but obviously when they're in a bit more fragile state, that doesn't go down that well. So be aware of that. So pyrroles are straightforward too. It's a urine test that you do. Again, costs around $80 to $100. Goes off to a lab in Brisbane. A lot of the labs around here know about it now. 5 years ago, no one knew about it. You can only get it done at a couple of labs, but now it's much more common. People have become much more aware of it. If you get a pyrrole test done, make sure you always get your zinc and your copper checked as well, okay, and your bloods, because that's really what you're measuring. You're not measuring your pyrroles as you go forward so much. You really want to know what the zinc and the copper levels are, and our goal is to get their ratio 1-to-1. When you get that 1-to-1 ratio, you get much better. You notice it in them, in the people who have it. They're much more balanced out. this next slide refers to what we're looking at in the gut as well. And this is a common thing that we see in people when we're testing because they come in, they're anxious, they've got digestive issues because of the anxiety as well, but also they had that, when you check the history, that actually probably pre-existed the anxiety, okay? And this is an 11-year-old boy, and he comes in with his E. coli level last year in April was 9%, okay, of what where it should be 95%, okay? And he had something called Klebsiella at 9% as well. Klebsiella shouldn't really be in there at all. It's an inflammatory bacteria. Look at his strep level here. That's that streptococcus I was talking about. It's 81%. Okay, and we get people who are 90%. It can be really much worse than that. And again, in kids, you see this all the time. His yeast is really high. Too much candida. Constantly addicted to sugar and love starch, and they constantly graze and they're hypoglycemic. And so this is a child with pyrrole, and then the gut aspect of it, okay? Because you see how they both cause each other? So you've got to deal with both of them to really get the result, okay? So when we look at the change on that, in that as well, and what you also see with these kids too is that the lactobacillus and the bifidus are also really low. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes the lactobacillus and the bifidus is actually high. And if you give them normal probiotics like Inner Health Plus or something, then they actually become reactive to it. Because those types of probiotics actually produce lactic acid. And lactic acid is produced by strep to keep the gut pH too low. So if you give lactic acid forming bacteria into the gut, even the good ones, it actually throws the balance out still. So really important to know that. It's not as simple sometimes as just going, oh yeah, I've had antibiotics, I'm going to take some Inner Health. In those chronic sort of cases, really got to know, well, what is living in there? And so we do this test called BioScreen, which goes off to Melbourne. It's a stool test, and it gives us an exact ratio of everything. And it's fantastic because then we know, okay, here's where you are, here's where we've got to get to. So in this case, we've followed up in the following year for his BioScreen test. Okay, after being on a good diet most of the time, he wasn't perfect, but he was reasonably good with it. We dealt with his pyrrole issues and did some emotional work with him to get him on track. And then he's brought his E. coli levels up to 92%, okay? So he's much more stable at that level because E. coli is producing his dopamine, E. coli is producing his serotonin, okay? So he's got the neurotransmitter resources that he needs, okay? Because that's come up, then he had no Klebsiella, okay? Klebsiella totally just feeds on sugar and starch, okay? Once you cut that out, then it stops. It turned out to be the bacteria that caused my inflammation too, interestingly enough. But it's just, so once you cut that out, it just doesn't exist anymore either. Okay, and then his yeast dropped into normal ranges. Also, in that time, his bifidus had come up quite well, but his lactobacillus is still low. So now we don't give him a multi-strain thing, we give him a very specific strain. He just gets lactobacillus, a delactate-free form, okay? So a form of lactobacillus that doesn't produce lactic acid. So there's a science to this stuff, and it's very measurable. And when you do it right, you can handle these complex cases and get them on track, and then you know where the boundaries are then. And also with kids, when you say, oh, you need to go on a diet to get this better, if you don't measure something, then that'll last for a couple of weeks and they're over it, But if there's a measurable goal you're going for, and you might, 3 months down the track go, look, where are we? And you go, that's good, that's not good, that means you did this. And they go, yeah, I did, Then they go, okay, well, how important is it for you to feel good, And then they'll start to take responsibility. And this case wasn't an easy one. He was a challenge with his parents with doing this, and they had some unique challenges of their own. But he managed to do it because he got the feedback on it. And then when he finally got to this point, and I said, well, how's your stomach pain? He goes, well, I haven't had it. I don't get it anymore. And then I asked his parents, how is he emotionally? Well, he's been much better, and he's coping with things a lot better, and he's on track, So that's the way that works when you get those things sorted out. E. coli as well is the one that it's the one that produces CoQ10, and if you know about CoQ10, it's the thing that is really important for your energy production, okay? And so people with low E. coli, they'll also drift from this, stressed and allergic sort of state into chronic fatigue if you don't get it under control. Okay, so super important. And so our chronic fatigue people all have low E. coli when we check them out. And so we give them the things they need initially as supplements, but once you get the gut right, you don't need to keep doing the supplements because the body will make it. But if you don't have the things in the first place, that's when you need the supplements. So our third kind of thing we look at, so we've got the gut with toxicity, the heavy metals and the methylation stuff, and then we really look at how the body processes emotion. okay? And this is such a key thing, because throughout life we start to accumulate stresses. Our body starts to have events happen to it that it creates a belief about, that we either think that was a good thing or that's a bad thing. If it was a really bad thing, then that creates something that we either will process or we'll lock it inside to protect ourselves from it in the future. And what the body does is it generalizes things. So if we're walking along and we get bitten by a snake, okay, then we're not, in the future, we're not just scared of snakes, we're scared of hoses, we're scared of sticks, we're scared of all these other things. And we might not even realize that we're scared of them. It's just that our amygdala is noticing them, okay? And what might happen then is that we don't even notice that that's been noticed, but we just start to be like this, and we don't know why. And we've got chronic neck pain, and we can't turn as much anymore, okay? But because we've got this tension in our traps that's just set at a certain level because our amygdala is constantly watching out for those things. Okay, and it's at an unconscious level. You have to understand that only 1 to 5% of your brain is your conscious mind. Okay, only 1 to 5% that you're aware of. Everything else that's happening in there, it's unconscious or subconscious. Okay, which is kind of good when it's digesting your food and all those sorts of things. But it's relating to the environment. It's feeling stuff. It's knowing exactly the emotional state of every person in the room just on the frequency of your heart. Because your heart's putting an 18-foot field out there, which affects my heart field, and it interacts, and our body makes a decision, are you safe or not? Okay? So these things are happening, and we're making all those decisions subconsciously that some pervade through, but only 1 to 5%, which is very interesting. So our subconscious mind sets our tone. It determines how wound up we are or not, okay? And our experience of life is determined by the state of the physiology that we're in when we experience it. So that's a super important thing to know. If you're exhausted and something stressful happens, then you're going to respond to it with fear or frustration, or you're terrified, or you want to hide, those sort of things. But if something challenging happens and you're feeling pretty good, okay, and you're feeling you've got the resources inside, then you can adapt. You can be of assistance. You can action that, okay. And then in doing so, you can actually turn something into an experience where your body doesn't hold on to it. If it never got to deal with it, then it holds on to it as a stress. So we deal with this situation where in life our cup starts to get a bit full, okay? And really what we need to do is we need to be able to declutter. You how good it feels to spring clean your house and just chuck stuff out, And you've got to do that to your brain. Your brain's got to defrag. You need things that just get in there and clean out the clutter occasionally. And you don't even realize how much stuff you're carrying usually. And not only that, it often doesn't take that much to clean it out when you know how to do it properly. So on an ongoing level, you need to be able to exercise and meditate and understand those things to do it. But NET is a really important tool to look at what are those things that are constantly firing the amygdala that's making us really stressed when we don't even know we're that stressed, okay? And sometimes we do know we're that stressed. But when we're dealing with anxiety, the key thing we want to sort of move people through when we're dealing with this is to understand that survival doesn't come from placing our attention on survival, okay? Survival comes from placing our attention on progression. What do we need to learn here? How do we need to grow? How do we evolve through this? Okay, and if you can find out why we're having this overwhelming response to it, why the fear, why the frustration, why the paralyzed will, if we can find out where that comes from, what belief in us drives that response to that situation that someone else might be able to manage. If we understand that and we can get to the bottom of that and know, oh, that came from this point when I was this age and this happened to me, it's such a relief. Your brain, your conscious mind goes back to the subconscious and goes, oh, it's just that little 10-year-old me that's stressing about that. That's okay. And you can start to clear these things out, and that energy can be released in a really powerful way. Tell me how you were feeling when you first came in and where you are now.
So about flying. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I was really anxious about I'd been on planes a lot before, mm-hmm. but then suddenly I was really anxious about it, and I didn't want to be in an enclosed space. I didn't like the feeling of not being in control of where I was going, or I felt really out of control, and I wanted to be able to physically control the situation, and I couldn't, which I found, that's what I found really daunting. And so the first time I went on, I literally broke down, and I couldn't, I almost didn't catch my flight, and it was just a short flight, and yeah, once I did it, I was like, it was really like liberating. But yeah, massive build up. I couldn't, like, for the whole week I couldn't think of anything else. Yeah, it was a massive fear of mine, which I'd never had before. Yeah, so it was really all consuming kind of. Yeah.
And how do you feel now after you're doing some NET work and releasing some emotion around that? How are you with flying now?
It's like, it's like second nature almost, and yeah, I now can fly by myself, and without emotional support, which I needed a lot at the time. And so it's like not even, I don't even think about getting anxious anymore. It's just really easy.
And where have you just been?
To Europe. I'm back. I'm back, yeah.
Yeah, how does that feel?
Yeah, really amazing. That's something that I could never have done like a year ago even. And now here I am.
Awesome.
Okay, so that's a situation with someone with fear of flying, and that's a classic situation of the amygdala being in overload. So fear of any sort of situation where she's not going to be in control. It took a whole team of people to get her on the plane the first time, and she was physically sick for days. So that's the amygdala just sending just this overwhelming amount of stress hormones through her system leading up to that, and then on the flight. And then she felt good when she got through it, but then she was terrified of doing it again. So we went through that process, the process of NET, of using muscle testing to find where does this come from in your unconscious, and releasing the energy of that. And that was such a powerful shift for her that she was able to fly to Europe by herself and back. So that's as in the spectrum of anxiety. That's one. The phobias are a certain subgroup, and there's a way in which we go about dealing with those. So NET stands for neuro-emotional technique, and it's a mind-body technique that uses a methodology for finding and removing neurological imbalances that come from emotional stress. Okay, so in emotional stress, it's important to understand that emotions are not just something that occur in your mind, okay, or in your brain. Emotions occur in every single cell in your body. Your body has a physiological response to every thought and every emotion. Okay, and those emotions generally get carried through a circuit of things called your meridian system. And in Chinese medicine, they know that certain meridians relate to specific emotions, like your liver will generally relate to anger, resentment, frustration. And there's certain areas of your body that will show up when people are angry. Like people commonly with anger will get neck pain because the gallbladder runs up there. They'll wake up with temporal headaches, okay? Or they'll get bursitis of the hip, okay? Because it's running up through there. So that's just one pattern, but there's, every single different emotion has a certain pattern that'll show up physically in the body. And these patterns are what we call neuro-emotional complexes or NECs. So there's 8 key things that NET is based on, okay? And one is that emotions are physiologically based. 2 is that of Pavlovian responses, that conditioning that happens. So we have something that happened, does everyone know Pavlov's dogs experiments, that kind of stuff? Okay, so it's just where they fed a dog, rang a bell, fed the dogs, ring the bell, fed the dogs, ring the bell, and in the end they could just ring the bell and the dogs salivate. So you condition the nervous system, condition the brain to expecting something. Okay, so this is something that happens in all nervous systems, all of us. We get conditioned to things. We have an expectation it's going to happen, then our body starts responding physiologically to that. Okay, so that's a really important concept to know, because that conditioning is what we've got to remove in order to remove anxiety. Because we have an expectation that something bad's going to happen from this situation, and so we've got to, remove that conditioning, so to speak. The third dynamic is that emotions have meridian system correlations, which was the one we just talked about before. And the other aspect is repetition compulsion, and this one we certainly see all the time, and certainly in family dynamics. And that's where you have a traumatic event happens at some time in your life, and then your unconscious mind keeps creating situations which you act that out until you work your way through it. Okay, so people going through the same sort of relationship issues all the time. Or people, they just reproduce, you see yourself, you get these patterns of things that you start to fall into, and that's repetition compulsion. And so dealing with that, that's something that's a Freud-based concept, and NET really looks at that by going back to the original time where that all starts as well. Also understanding the role of memory in physiology. So your memory is not a fixed thing. It's not like a movie you can go back and get exactly what happened at that time frame. Your memories constantly change. If you tell yourself a story about something and keep embellishing it, that becomes the reality. That's the new truth, okay, for you. Which is cool in some ways, because if we do things like NET and we can go back and find the original event and change the memory and integrate it in some way, then that memory is no longer stored the same way in our physiology. Okay, so memories are malleable and they can change all the time, and they do change all the time. Just having the thought of that going back and replaying something starts to change it. We can manipulate that, which is really, really important to understand. A key thing NET is based on is muscle testing, and I'll go through that a bit more in a second. But it's a great way of just being able to assess, what's happening in the body quickly and get that feedback instantly. And the other thing with NET is semantic responses. So understanding that the body will respond to any stress, and that stress can be a physical stress, auditory stress, okay, so something you say, or it can just be an energy stress too. The frequency of something will also do it as well. And there's also the concept of like cures like. In NET, just like in homeopathy, you give a small amount of something and it can actually help to fix the problem. And the same with NET. You can have traumatic events. When we do PTSD work with people, post-traumatic stress disorder, we go back and we experience things, but we do it in a way in which is nowhere near as traumatic as when it actually happened. But it's still a little bit traumatic, because you've got to have a little bit of the trauma to fix the trauma. Okay? And that's a really important principle of healing, and understanding that if you don't face it, if you don't deal with it at all, or don't handle any of that, then your body won't overcome it. So when we talk about muscle testing, there's three different key types, and there's orthopedic muscle tests, which if you have a shoulder injury or you go to a neurologist or something, they'll be testing how your muscles, how strong they are, and give it a rating out of 0 to 5. There's functional neurological muscle testing, which is when we're actually using it to determine what they call cognitive dissonance, or a disagreement between your conscious mind and your unconscious mind, okay, or a stress that happens in the body in some way, okay. And there's also another form, which is the subconscious lie detector manual muscle test. Again, that's when people do muscle testing and they're making yes or no statements or predicting the future or the past in some way. And there's no science to support that, okay? But people do it. So I'm just letting you know that you do, when people do that stuff, they get an answer because there's an expectation to get an answer. They've done a lot of studies on it, and the research they've done on that, it doesn't seem to work. Even if they do something as simple as predicting the sex of a child from a pregnant mum, that doesn't come out. That's about the same as chance, okay? Because there's no predictive aspect of it. God designed it so we don't get that, for obvious reasons, okay? But the way to understand muscle testing is it's an involuntary response. It's very much the same as doing a knee reflex, a deep tendon reflex, okay? It will happen, and the test is done before your conscious mind really knows what's happened, okay? And that's where the practitioner should be able to detect that really quickly. Because what your brain does is it goes weak initially, and then it tries to recruit to overcome it, okay? So in recruiting, it feels like the practitioner pushes harder, but it's really just you're using more effort to try and do it, because there's about a 20% loss of the energy in that muscle at the time when it happens. And it's important to understand that when you do it, it's not an arm wrestle. So don't do it in a way in which you're trying to win, but it's just doing it to see if you can just hold on it, which is really, really important. So for this to work properly, both the patient and practitioner have to participate. If you get someone who doesn't want to do it, doesn't want to test, then you can't test them. But both the patient and the practitioner need to be relatively neutral on things when you're doing it. So the practitioner certainly, if the practitioner has an agenda, if they've got issues of their own that are coming through in this particular case, or they have an opinion about something, then they'll find that, okay? Because they can easily subtly direct their force in order to, and they do it unconsciously. It's just that the body's really smart and it'll create what it's looking for, So we've got to be very, very neutral when we do it, and just be, what we train all our practice to do is just be curious. It's like, what if that happened, And you don't go in there with a real agenda to find anything. It's just being curious to see what comes up. When they did muscle test comparisons for congruent and incongruent self-referential statements, what they did then was just get people to say things that was true for them and then things that are definitely not true for them, okay? And when you say something that's not true for you, then you're 17% weaker, okay, than when you say something that's true for you. And that's what we're picking up. And that's a great thing to understand, because when you're doing neuroemotional work and you find that, I feel frustrated about this because, then what we can do then is find out by getting you to say certain statements that are true or not true for you, to find out how far does that go? How far do you generalize this? What's your emotional reality? What's the full extent of this neuroemotional complex that you have? Is it affecting all of these things, or is it just affecting this one relationship with this person? And what you find often is it's generalized right out, One of the things we see with people with chronic illnesses as well is you go, it's okay for me to be well, okay? And they go weak. Okay, it's okay for me to be sick, and they're strong. So they're congruent with being sick and not congruent with being well, and that's called a psychological reversal. There's a secondary gain from being sick that they've learnt over their life, and quite often it's when a parent, they might have been the fourth child or something, and the only time they got any attention was when they were sick. Just a simple little pattern like that. But it sets up that pattern that goes along, and it's certainly no one's fault, not the parents' fault at the time, but it's one of those things that just happen. But it builds as a belief, and it can create those sort of things. And there's stuff, you clean that up and the body self-heals a lot better. So NET allows us to access what is triggering stress at a subconscious level. So when we're testing it, when we can find when the time was, we can find exactly who it relates to, what it relates to, because it can either be money and the material things, love and your relationships, or it can be about you and your relationship with yourself. Okay, so we can quickly work out which one it is by what goes weak with semantic testing. And a person will always weaken when they get on the stressful subject. So they might say, so it goes back to an event when you're 16, and they say, I think that's when this happened, and you'll test it, and it's like, no, that doesn't go weak. So even though that's the first memory they had, it's not the thing that's associated with it. Okay, and then they'll go, well, what about this? And then once they throw that concept out there, you can test that and go, yeah, now we're onto it. And from that, you can start to build what it's about, and how that works. Because really what we want is the subject, we want the why, and we want to know the specific emotion, that's involved with that. And then we can clear it out. So finding the original event helps release the trapped energy. Okay, this is really important. There's this energy that's trapped in your body when you've got an unresolved emotion. This is why it's so exhausting for those people who sat in the theatre and were told not to express any emotion when they had all their emotions being triggered. What was exhausting for them? Because it's trapped energy, and it's got to be contained. Something's got to hold it there. Okay, so it's an unconscious part of yourself that holds it there, but it takes energy to do that. Okay, and that's why you can be exhausted when you build up too much clutter in your nervous system. And you need to take some of that stuff out. So when we release an NET, we release an NEC, then the actual emotion that comes out, people can either cry, or they'll go red, or but what you see the most is a lot of heat comes out. The room goes really hot, they become all sweaty, and that's just the energy being processed of that. Okay? And from that, once that's processed, they generally feel lighter and they feel that shift. And when you get there's a course we do called Net Success, which is a Heal the Healer weekend. It's 3 days of NET, and you're working with all experienced NET practitioners. And often, as a practitioner, it's hard to get the work done on yourself all the time. So you spend these 3 days just going through, and we'll just do it non-stop for 3 days. And after that, you get home, you'll be pretty exhausted at the end of the day because you've been working on different people. But when you come back and you integrate that the next week, you have so much more energy. There's never an end to it. Okay, so you don't get to a point where, okay, I'm fixed now, okay, because it just doesn't happen. You'll be surprised at how much stuff you actually have going on. But the more you clear, the lighter you get, and the more aware of yourself you are. Okay, the more you know exactly what's led to you to get to this point. Okay, and that's such a powerful thing to understand and be really that gives you such a strong sense of self. And that allows you to adapt to stresses a lot better. I've had a few really intense post-traumatic stress cases in the last 6 weeks at work, and they've all been based on, as I talked about at the start, suicides and those sorts of things. There's been a lot of it going on, but it's amazing how powerful this is as a tool for these people. okay, who've been through that. So they're doing a case study at the moment, a large study at the moment over in America, where they're looking at cancer patients and the cancer patients who are being treated, but they've got PTSD associated with their diagnosis, or a procedure they had done that was really painful, like a biopsy or something that was really painful, and then they're terrified of hospitals now, or intervention, or getting more treatment, and that kind of stuff. And what they've found with this is with 3 to 5 treatments of NET, the amygdala gets turned off. Okay. Now, when you look at what it's normally like out there and how long extinguishing it can take to extinguish an emotion like that, which can be, well, sometimes never, okay? It's 3 to 5 visits. And that's what we see in here. We'll see someone with full-on PTSD, and by the 3rd visit, they're a lot better, you know, which is amazing, especially when you see what they're like when they first walk in, you know, when there's just so much stress. And that thought is just, it's so on the front of their mind that they can't think of anything else other than those visions of what happened, you know. And to see them, I had a classic case of it this week where this person who I'm referring to came in after going through such an intense process a couple of weeks earlier. Then we slowly integrated things after that. Then he came in, he just looked, 10 years younger, completely different. And I was ready to go, and he goes, "So today I want to talk to you about my hip." And I've gone, awesome. What a cool thing. We're going to talk about the pain in your hip, compared to where we were a couple of weeks ago, which were in some dark places, So it's amazing how that, once that shift happens, you're like, great, their brain goes on to whatever the next thing is that's worrying them. But the coolest thing there is you go, okay, great, this is the thing that was stopping you exercising, and now we need to start getting the resources together so you can get back to, losing the weight that you put on because you were so stressed out, and, and stopping you from having the lifestyle that you wanted to have, So we move in the direction of, again, survival doesn't come from focusing on survival, right? So survival focuses on coming on progression. We don't want to stay there and water the weeds. We don't want to do NET on them forever once they make that shift. So when they make that shift, we move straight from emotion straight to physical. So great, let's get you training. Let's look at what you need for your constitution. Let's look at what exercises you can scale into your life, because it doesn't take much. It might only take 10 to 20 minutes of them to do something every second day for them to make that shift. It's really not that much. So we look at what is needed to make that shift, and what are the specific things that you can do, and what do they enjoy doing, what's fun for them. That's where we try and take it. So you just move in the direction of evolution for them, and it's so powerful. So NET allows us that ability to just step in there, create that change, and then step out and go, okay, now what's required so we can just focus on now, okay? And for some people that happens quickly. For other people there's lots of different layers, and it depends again on your constitution and how your brain, because we have different set points of sensitivity. People can be more on the neurotic spectrum. I mean, if you're higher on the neurotic spectrum, then you need more emotional work sometimes to keep you on track. But then, again, as a practitioner, it's knowing when to just, not water the weeds too much either, and shift them out of that. So thank you, everyone. I hope that was not too overwhelming in content, okay? But in reality, they're the key things that are involved, and in practice, we see that stuff just so commonly, and it can make such a big difference when you know what to look for and then how to address it. And it's relatively simple in the way in which you deal with it clinically once you know what you're looking for, and you can get those changes on what otherwise turns out to be a really complex thing if it's not well managed.